I don't claim any credit for these slides. I buy everything that's in them, but they were from Andy Reader BT, my former colleague. Andy was required by his family to attend a children's event in the UK, so he couldn't be here this week. So I agreed to give the end user advisory group, and I'm not going to read all these slides out to you. And is Shoma here from Amazon Web Services? Yeah, Shoma, I'm going to present these, but if there's any questions at the end, I'm going to point at you probably, right? So thanks for that. So one of the things I've been associated, as Francisca Javier knows, with this project since the very beginning. In fact, I advocated for it to go to ETSI, if you remember. And I liked it because it brought it much closer to the work that I was doing in ETSI NFV in the standards domain. So although it doesn't really practice matter where you're hosted, there's a lot about ETSI that I really like, and when the community decided that they would go to ETSI, I was very pleased about that. And I'm even more pleased that Vanessa's talked about alignment with SOL. Of course, you know, the question, I'm going to just ramble, by the way. You're wondering why I'm not stepping the slides on, because you can read the slides in the picture. I might talk about the slides at some point. How long have I got? I haven't got 20 minutes, surely. I can't ramble here for 20 minutes. So what we might do is, okay, so let me get back to some structure. So what I like about open source Mano is simplicity. And I loved your analogy with the Starship Enterprise, as obviously a rather young fan of the Starship team, to see that linkage between the Enterprise with 383 units of complexity versus open source Mano's 2 units of complexity. But the point is that complexity isn't inherently bad, but in networks, simplicity is key to reliability and also evolution. So what I'm really pleased to see as an end user, and when I say I'm an end user, I'm going to point at my software architect, Randy. I always point you out in audiences. The CableLabs software architect is Randy Levenseler, and Randy's the end user of open source Mano in the sense that he's downloaded it, run it, critiqued it, met with Francisca Javier to complain about the things he would like to see improved. And so there's a real end user interaction between the software team at CableLabs and the OSM team. And in fact, we hosted the open source Mano number 5 meeting 2 weeks ago in Boulder, in Louisville. So we are active in that sense. But the simplicity that has become evident through Francisca Javier's presentation is in the improvements that you're now seeing. So in other words, we're not growing the scope. We've got the scope nicely bounded to the Mano. I know we've got the service orchestration layer. But as a R&D leader through many, many years, coming up with ideas is easy. Implementation is hard. Operationalizing and then deploying is really hard. And so you have to get to the point where you've got a really robust and confident that you've got the best possible place to get to deployment. And so I'm seeing that as you've gone through the successive releases, it's not about expanding the scope, it's about making it more robust, more stable, including the newer techniques that you didn't choose to begin with because you wanted to bite off something that was digestible, okay? So really about learning by doing. And then the convergence with ETSI NFV has always been the end goal for me as an advocate for open source Mano. But the point is that you began at the beginning of 2016, and we only just published the summer of 2017, the first of the SOL specs, right? So here's an example of open source being ahead of the standards game, right? The standards teams are steadily generating consensus, understanding the rationale for the specs. This is the point I think somebody made in one of the panels this morning. It's about, in the end, to get to a goal which is an ecosystem where everybody plays on a level playing field, you have to achieve some kind of consensus on what the goal is, right? And you can develop consensus through study, discussion, and then ultimately spec, or you can develop some kind of consensus by code, inserting the code into the core, presumably by some formal mechanism of approval, right? Not just any piece of code can be dumped in, right? So there is that, but in the end, you've got developers developing towards the goal, which the goal, of course, the requirements for NFV, and you've got specification people that are also working for the goal, but they're in two different communities. So then you've got this problem of communication, and Vanessa mentioned documentation. If the code isn't well documented, how do you ever know how the code works? And one of the things that I'm quite proud of, actually, is I wrote a whole load of code, actually, in my life. In fact, I hacked code once upon a time. I stole, in my early career, for personal use, I stole a graphics program. The statute of limitations is now far gone, so I can admit this, just because I wanted to use that code. But I need to port it from a proprietary operating system to CPM. Who remembers CPM? Right? Any of you remember that? Oh my God, you're all that old. I need to port it. So I had to basically disassemble it. Who knows about assembly language, right? Disassemble it, and then this was assembly code as well, reassemble it. And as I disassembled it, I found all of the traps that the software writer had put in there to prevent me disassembling it. For example, putting in text that had been coded with a very simple encryption mechanism, so that you didn't know it was text, you thought it was object code, right? So this is back in 1985. And then I've written, at university, we wrote in a language which was called Lisp. Remember that? Lisp processing language. Now it's been hijacked for something else, and now you know I really am rambling. So I've written a lot of code in my life, but I've long since left it behind. So when you guys talk about containers and Kubernetes and all of that stuff, I have to go to Randy humbly and ask him what it all means, because I've long since left all that behind. So the judge on whether any of this is any good is going to be by the software developers. But the judge on whether it's any good for deployment, well, that's me, right? Because what I then point at, I point to another guy at CableLabs, which is Robin Koo over there, Robin over there. Robin is my network test guy. So Randy's job is to create software that can go into a network environment and have packets sent through it. And then I'm interested in packet throughput. I'm interested in jitter. I'm interested in resiliency. And I'm interested in a whole bunch of stuff that software has to deliver in terms of requirements. And so that's the bit where the networks people and the software people have to come together, and the software has to prove that it can meet all of those parameters for networking. And Robin's in our subsidiary Curio, where a lot of this NFV stuff is going to come into our labs and have DOCSIS packets thrown through it. My favorite diagram of all time, in fact, this is a beautiful diagram. The reason this diagram is so beautiful is that this was originally conceived in ETSI NFV, and indeed, Francisco Javier, you were there. It was finally agreed in the bar in Madrid, was it? Was it in Madrid, or was it earlier? Where Michael Brenner was creating a conversation which was trying to resolve some operator disagreements over whether we had things called element managers in this new architecture, or whether we would only allow virtual network function managers. And as an old telco guy, I kind of said, well, element managers are not going to disappear, so we have to have them, right? So we have these things called element managers sitting there, up there, but that was not the preferred way to go, right? They're there for simplicity to show that in an NFV world, you're going to be orchestrating virtual infrastructures and physical infrastructures. And in fact, in the cable world, we're beginning to get clarity now on what that access architecture is beginning to look like. It's beginning to look like a bunch of existing cable modem transmission systems in physical boxes, which are the ones we've already got there, because they're not going to go away. But the new ones, which do all of the new DOCSIS 3.1, full duplex DOCSIS, distributed access architecture, a whole bunch of stuff where the cable network is going, are going to be virtualized. And they're going to sit right next to these physical ones. And then the next thing you need to realize is that if you've got physical instances of a network coexisting with virtualized instances of a network, then it's pretty obvious that the virtual ones need to do pretty much the same things as the existing physical ones do, right? So this thing, this virtualized thing, has to be able to reproduce the network performance and the network characteristics of the existing stuff in at least my version of the cable architecture. So it's really important that this serves the needs. The reason why this diagram is very beautiful is we started off with a diagram which was based on thousands of hours of discussion between, I guess, active network operators involved in that discussion were probably about 12. The ones that were really nitty-gritty, really interested in what this diagram actually looked like. And with us were the bunch of vendors that were ultimately going to have to build this stuff and sell it. So they had a view too, right? So you've got vendors and operators. Not all the operators are aligned. Because as I said in my earlier talk, each of them has got unique individual circumstances, both regulatory, local, commercial objectives. So all of this has got to meet a very, very, very diverse set of criteria. And this diagram is actually put now, I think it was agreed around about August 2013. So 4.5 years on, and this diagram has stayed the same. But then along comes open source Mano, OpenO, and a bunch of other guys that started to implement something that was akin to this architecture, but we did not have the final ETSI specs until very recently. So the code has definitely gone ahead of the specs. And Vanessa has provided you with a lot of detail around that, which I'm not equipped to talk through, and indeed you wouldn't want me to talk through. I've managed to talk through 12 minutes already. You've already heard about Release 3, so I don't need to talk about that. In fact, you've even got a preview of Release 4. And that's thank you from me, and I actually gained you all 8 minutes of time. And I'm happy to take questions. But if there's anything to do with software at CableLabs, I'm going to point at Randy, but more likely you can use the time to talk to Francis Javier and Vanessa about the actual progress that these guys are making, which is excellent. So thanks a lot.